When we speak of the scapegoat, we do not merely invoke an old ritual in which the sins of a community were symbolically placed upon a creature and cast into the wilderness. We are speaking of a psychic reality that has repeated itself in countless families, in hidden corners of homes, and in the silent suffering of children who bore the burdens of others' shadows. The scapegoat is not chosen by accident. The scapegoat is unconsciously designated by the collective psyche of the family system, a living vessel into which the unresolved conflicts, shame, and denied impulses of others are deposited. The child who becomes the scapegoat is forced to carry what does not belong to them, and yet this very burden, terrible though it is, can awaken within them the very sensitivity that, when integrated, matures into the gift of empathy. This journey from being the unwanted receptacle of pain to becoming one who sees into the depths of the soul is not a linear road. It is an archetypal pattern, and as with all archetypes, it unfolds with paradox. The scapegoat is both cursed and chosen. They are crushed under projections, yet they are also given the chance to awaken the eye that sees beyond appearances. What looks like exile is often the initiation into vision. Imagine a child who grows up in a household where anger, envy, or fear cannot be acknowledged. The father is consumed by frustration but denies it. The mother feels envy but represses it. The family must maintain an image of normalcy, and so these rejected energies are projected outward. Onto whom? Onto the child, who somehow absorbs them, who somehow mirrors the very emotions others cannot face. This child becomes the difficult one, the too sensitive one, the problem. But beneath this role lies a deeper truth. The child has been appointed the bearer of the unconscious. They live in exile within their own home. But it is precisely there that their eyes are open to realities others refuse to see. The scapegoat's wound is that they are never seen for who they truly are. They are treated not as subjects, but as objects of projection. Yet, paradoxically, it is through this very wound that they develop the acute perception of what lies beneath masks. The empath is born through suffering, because only through being unseen can one develop the hunger to see truly. Only through being misunderstood can one develop the burning fire to understand. I have often said that neurosis is the suffering of a soul that has not discovered its meaning. The scapegoat is often driven into neurosis, burdened by guilt that does not belong to them, haunted by shame they did not earn, weighed down by the silent sorrows of their family line. And yet, when such a person dares to turn toward their suffering rather than away from it, when they stop trying to escape the desert and instead begin to listen to what the wilderness whispers, they discover something extraordinary. Their wound contains the seed of vision. The eyes that were forced to watch the cruelty of misunderstanding become the eyes that discern subtle truth. In dreams, this transformation often appears symbolically. One might dream of being chased by a monstrous figure, only to discover upon turning toward it that the monster is carrying a hidden treasure. Or one might dream of being cast out, into the night, only to find that the stars begin to speak. Such images reveal that the psyche itself is guiding the scapegoat toward the role of seer. What others discard becomes the very material of revelation. The empath is not simply one who feels the emotions of others. They are one who has been initiated through suffering into the mystery of interconnection. They know the weight of being unseen, and so they long to see. They know the agony of being unheard, and so they listen. But without consciousness, this gift can become a curse. For the empath may continue to live as scapegoat, endlessly absorbing the pain of others, believing it to be their duty. They may confuse empathy with martyrdom, compassion with self-erasure. And so the task of individuation for such a soul is to discover boundaries not as walls of rejection, but as the sacred vessel in which their gift can be preserved without annihilation. Consider for a moment the archetype of the Christ, who bore the sins of the world. This image has burnt itself into the Western unconscious, yet the true meaning is not literal, it is symbolic. The Christ archetype reveals the transmutation of suffering into vision, the transformation of rejection into revelation, to carry the shadow of others without becoming consumed by it. This is the sacred path of the empath. But it requires consciousness, it requires the courage to descend into one's own depths and to discern what is mine and what is not mine. The scapegoat, when unconscious, believes they are what others project. They identify with the guilt, with the shame, with the defectiveness that was placed upon them. They live as though they are truly unworthy. But when the scapegoat becomes conscious, they recognize that they were chosen by the family's unconscious to play a role. They see that they are not the guilt itself, but the vessel into which guilt was poured. And in this recognition, the chains begin to break. It is often in the silence of exile that the first whispers of the inner voice emerge. The child who sits alone in their room, feeling misunderstood, may turn inward and begin to converse with imagination, with dreams, with symbols. They may feel the stirring of archetypal forces before they can even name them. This is why so many empaths are also drawn to the mystical, the artistic, the symbolic. They are not merely seeking escape. They are seeking resonance with what their soul already knows, that reality is deeper than appearances, that truth is veiled, that the invisible shapes the visible. But let me warn you, the path from scapegoat to seer is not guaranteed. Many remain trapped in the role of victim, never daring to claim their vision. Others drown in empathy, losing themselves in the emotions of others. It is only when the wounded child recognizes the archetypal dimension of their suffering that transformation occurs, when they realize, I was made the scapegoat, but I am not the scapegoat. I am the one who sees. Then the exile turns to initiation. You may ask, why must it be the child? Why must innocence suffer in order for empathy to be born? This is one of the most painful riddles of existence, and yet, if we look deeply into the mystery of the psyche, we see that it is precisely innocence that is capable of bearing projections without collapsing. The child has not yet solidified a rigid ego. They are porous, open, receptive. It is their very openness that allows them to absorb what others cannot. What begins as vulnerability becomes, when integrated, the foundation of visionary perception. The wounded child is the one who later, as an adult, can sit with another's pain without turning away. They can enter the underworld of another's despair because they themselves have walked those corridors. They can sense the tremors beneath a smile, the sorrow behind a boast, the fear beneath anger. They can see because they have been unseen. This is why I say the scapegoat is paradoxically the potential seer. What is cursed may also be blessed if only consciousness arises. But to awaken consciousness requires courage. It requires the willingness to descend into the wound, to face the shadow, to wrestle with the inner figures that haunt the psyche. Only by confronting the archetype directly can one move beyond it. Only by turning toward the monster in the dream can one discover the hidden treasure. And so, I invite you now to reflect upon your own life. Have you not felt the weight of being misunderstood? Have you not at times carried burdens that did not belong to you? Have you not felt like the exile, wandering through the wilderness of others' projections? If so, then know that you stand within this ancient pattern, but also know that within this pattern lies the seed of transformation. Do not despise the exile. Do not curse the wilderness, for in the silence of those deserts, the voice of the self begins to speak. In the wound itself lies the path to vision. The scapegoat, when awakened, becomes the seer, and the seer does not merely survive, they illuminate. The scapegoat lives within a mythic pattern. When we look at ancient rituals, we see that the animal chosen to bear the community's sins was not selected because it was weak, but because it could hold what the tribe could not. This is precisely what happens in the psychological family drama. The child who becomes scapegoat is the one unconsciously chosen to carry what is unbearable, and though this feels like cruelty, it is also destiny, for within that suffering lies the spark of transformation. The psyche is always symbolic. What we live outwardly is mirrored inwardly in images, dreams, and myths. The scapegoated child may grow to dream of being chased, persecuted, or cast out, but the unconscious often reveals in these same dreams a deeper truth, that the persecuted one carries within them a secret light. You may find yourself dreaming of wandering alone in the wilderness, only to stumble upon a hidden spring of water. Or you may see yourself covered in wounds, only to discover that from these wounds emerge radiant beams of light. The unconscious does not deceive, it instructs, it whispers that exile is the threshold to vision, that the rejected part of you contains the very power that others sought to suppress. To become the seer, the empath must undergo a descent. This is the same descent spoken of in myth, the katabasis into the underworld. the entry into the cave, where the dragon guards the treasure, you cannot ascend without first descending. You cannot see light without first embracing darkness. The empath's descent is into their own wound, into the shame that has haunted them, into the voices that told them they were unworthy. To face these voices is terrifying, for they are often internalized as one's very identity. The scapegoated child grows into an adult who hears, in the silence of their soul, I am wrong, I am defective, I am unlovable. To confront these voices is to face the dragon. But when you do, something astonishing happens. You realize those voices are not your own. They were placed there. They are the echoes of projection. And in that realization, the chains begin to loosen. The archetype of the scapegoat transforms when the individual sees the symbolic nature of their suffering. No longer is the exile just a rejection, it is an initiation. No longer is the wound just a scar, it is a portal. The empath is born at the threshold where pain meets meaning. But beware, empathy without boundaries is possession. The empath who has not learned to distinguish between self and other is constantly flooded by the emotions of those around them. They feel every sorrow, every rage, every anxiety, as if it were their own. They drown in a sea of psychic energies. This is not true empathy, it is enmeshment. To become the seer, the empath must learn the art of discernment. They must learn to ask, is this feeling mine, or does it belong to another? Is this sorrow the echo of my own wound, or the projection of another's? Only by discerning this can the empath remain sovereign. Dreams again provide guidance here. Many empaths dream of floods, tidal waves, or storms sweeping them away. Such images reveal the danger of drowning in the collective unconscious. Yet in some dreams, one learns to build a vessel, to steer through the flood. That vessel is the symbol of boundaries, of the conscious ego learning to contain the vast energies of the unconscious. To become the seer is not to dissolve into the ocean of collective emotions, but to sail upon it, to listen, to interpret, to see patterns within the chaos. The empath's vision is unique, while others are blinded by appearances. The empath perceives the undercurrents. They sense when words conceal wounds, when anger masks despair, when laughter hides sorrow. They do not do this through logic, but through resonance, for their own wound has tuned them to the frequency of suffering. Just as a harp string vibrates when another string of the same pitch is struck, so too does the empath's soul resonate with the pain of others. This is the gift of their wound. Yet, if the empath remains unconscious, this resonance becomes a curse. They feel everyone's pain but cannot distinguish it from their own. They are perpetually exhausted, depleted, and confused. They sacrifice themselves endlessly, mistaking martyrdom for love. And so, the path forward requires the empath to become conscious of the archetype moving within them. When they see that their suffering is not merely personal but archetypal, when they understand that they are living a myth that has been played out for centuries, They begin to gain distance. They begin to see themselves not merely as victim, but as participant in a greater pattern. This is the moment the scapegoat becomes the seer, when personal pain becomes symbolic revelation. I recall a patient who carried within her the burden of her family's unspoken conflicts. She had been accused from childhood of being too much, too emotional, too sensitive, too dramatic. And yet, when she described her inner life, she revealed dreams rich with symbols, visions of figures both terrifying and luminous. She could sense in others the unspoken griefs they tried to hide. At first, this gift tormented her. She felt overwhelmed, broken, unstable. But as she learned to recognize that what she carried was not only hers, that she was living out an archetypal role, she began to see her suffering differently. She was not cursed. She was initiated. Her empathy was not a flaw, but a faculty. What once broke her became her sight. The scapegoat becomes the seer by transmuting shame into vision. Shame is the poison that convinces the child they are unworthy. But when examined, shame often reveals itself as projection. The empath who bears shame must ask, whose shame is this? Who refused to face their own shadow and placed it upon me? When this question is asked deeply, the alchemical work begins. Shame is burned away in the fire of awareness, and in its place arises compassion, not the compassion of self-erasure, but the compassion that sees the wound in others without losing the self. This is the great paradox. To become the seer, the empath must first turn their gaze inward. They must see themselves. They must witness their own wound, their own shadow, their own denied rage and grief. Without this, they remain trapped as scapegoat. For the danger of the empath is that they are so focused on others that they forget themselves. They heal everyone else while leaving their own soul bleeding. They see everyone else while remaining blind to their own depths. To break this pattern is to face oneself with the same compassion one extends outward. Only then can true vision emerge. And so I say to you, the wound you carry is not your enemy. It is the doorway. The rejection you suffered is not meaningless. It is the threshold. The exile you endured is not the end. It is the initiation. When you recognize this, the archetype shifts. The scapegoat becomes not merely the outcast, but the visionary, the one who sees what others cannot. You must ask yourself, then, are you still living as the scapegoat, carrying the projections of others without awareness? Or are you beginning to step into the role of the seer, discerning the symbolic meaning of your suffering, claiming your gift without losing yourself? This is a decisive turning point. For to be the seer is not to escape suffering, it is to see its meaning. It is to recognize that every wound contains a symbol, every exile hides a revelation, every rejection conceals a calling. To live this way is to live mythically, to see your own life not as random chaos, but as the unfolding of a deep pattern. And when you live this way, you no longer drown in empathy, You navigate it. You no longer collapse under projection. You transmute it. You no longer remain unseen. You see, the archetypal shadow always lurks behind the experience of the scapegoat. When a family, a culture, or even an entire society cannot face its own darkness, it seeks a vessel. This vessel is unconsciously chosen a person who carries within them a certain openness, a certain permeability. The scapegoated child absorbs what others deny. But if you look more closely, you will see that this pattern is not limited to the family. It is woven into the fabric of civilization itself. Societies create scapegoats in the same way families do. They exile those who threaten the fragile image of collective purity. They project their guilt onto outsiders, minorities, heretics, witches, and yet, time and again, it is these very figures, these rejected ones, who reveal the deepest truths of the age. This is why I say that the scapegoat is also the prophet in disguise. The one who is excluded becomes the one who sees, for when you live outside the walls of consensus, your eyes adjust to a broader horizon. You begin to perceive what those inside cannot. The exile sees the cracks in the walls, the falseness of the masks, the hollowness of the rituals. The empath, born of this exile, is not merely a sufferer, but a potential awakener. They sense currents that others refuse to acknowledge. They pierce through appearances, for they have lived too long in the world of appearances not to know their emptiness. But here lies a danger. When you are made the scapegoat, you internalize the very shadow that has been projected upon you. You begin to believe you are truly defective, cursed, unworthy. You carry within yourself the voices of the persecutors. And these voices do not disappear with time. They echo in the unconscious, shaping dreams, creating anxiety, manifesting as self-sabotage. If you have ever found yourself rejecting love, mistrusting joy, or feeling guilty in moments of happiness, you may be hearing those internalized voices. They whisper that you do not deserve light, because long ago you were forced to carry darkness. The path of individuation requires confronting these inner persecutors. They may appear in dreams as critical figures, as tormentors, as faceless crowds that point and accuse. They may appear as inner dialogues that erode your confidence. The task is not to silence them by force, but to engage them, to turn towards them, to ask, whose voice are you? What shadow do you carry? What projection are you bearing? When you ask these questions, you begin to unravel the spell. You begin to see that these voices are not the essence of your soul, but residues of what others could not bear. The scapegoat must descend into the underworld of their own psyche. And in that descent, they encounter not only the persecutors, but also the figures of power, archetypal guides, inner images that reveal the path forward. The dream of being guided by a wise old figure, or encountering a luminous child, or discovering a hidden temple. These are signs that the self, the totality of the psyche is leading you toward integration. The very unconscious that once seemed to torment you now reveals itself as the source of healing. Integration does not mean escaping the archetype, but seeing through it. The empath does not cease to feel. They do not build cold walls. Rather, they learn to contain their perception within a conscious vessel. They learn to discern what belongs to them and what belongs to another. They learn that empathy without selfhood is possession, but empathy with boundaries is vision. The seer emerges when empathy becomes conscious, when sensitivity is no longer a wound, but an organ of perception. There is a reason prophets are often described as wounded figures. They are not those who lived untouched by suffering, but those who bore it and transmuted it. The empath's power is not that they avoided exile, but that they lived through it and emerged with eyes that see differently. They know the taste of abandonment, and so they recognize it in the eyes of others. They know the burn of rejection, and so they can name it where it hides. Their suffering becomes their sight. But let us not romanticize this journey too quickly. For many, the wound remains raw. Many live their entire lives in the role of scapegoat, endlessly repeating the pattern, never realizing the archetypal meaning of their suffering. They seek out relationships that replicate the original dynamic. They become the friend who is always blamed, the partner who always absorbs the pain, the worker who always becomes the target without consciousness. The scapegoat archetype repeats itself endlessly, as if the psyche itself demands recognition. This is why awakening is so vital. Consciousness is the breaking of repetition. What then is the task of the empath who would become seer? It is to stand at the threshold where inner and outer worlds meet and to speak the truth that has been hidden. The seer is not only one who perceives, they are one who dares to reveal, and this revelation is rarely welcomed, for it exposes what has been denied. Recall how prophets are treated in every tradition. They are resisted, mocked, silenced, persecuted. To speak the truth of the shadow is to threaten the fragile equilibrium of those who live in denial, and yet this is precisely why the seer is necessary. Without them, the community stagnates. Without them, the individual remains trapped in illusion. The empath who has matured into seerhood becomes a bridge. They translate the language of the unconscious into speech that others can hear. They reveal the hidden wound in a way that invites healing rather than blame. They embody compassion not as self-sacrifice but as clarity. They do not drown in the suffering of others, but they also do not turn away. They stand in the paradox of feeling deeply while seeing clearly. Let me tell you a dream that one of my patients shared, a dream that embodies this transformation. In the dream, she was chained to a stone, accused by a crowd of countless voices. They shouted that she was guilty, that she was to blame. But as the dream unfolded, she noticed that the chains were not locked. She could remove them at any time. When she did, the crowd vanished, and in their place appeared a vast landscape filled with light. She realized that her captivity had been an illusion, sustained by her belief in their accusations. The moment she saw the truth, she was free. Such is the way of the scapegoat's transformation. The voices lose their power when you see through their projection. The empath who becomes seer is no longer defined by exile. They are defined by vision. They no longer ask, why me? But rather, what does this reveal? They no longer see their wound as meaningless, but as initiation. And through this, they gain the authority to guide others through their own shadows. To live as seer is not to live above suffering, but to live within it consciously. It is to perceive the archetypal patterns at work in one's own life and in the life of the collective. It is to recognize when society itself creates scapegoats, when it projects its own unresolved guilt onto the vulnerable. The seer refuses to participate in this unconscious ritual. They call it out, they shine light upon it, they bear witness to the shadow. And so, I say again, the scapegoat is the potential seer. The empath is the bridge between suffering and vision. But only when consciousness arises does this transformation occur. Without consciousness, the empath remains forever wounded, forever lost in the flood of emotions. With consciousness, the empath becomes the one who sees into the depths, who interprets dreams, who discerns shadows, who illuminates paths. Your task, then, is to recognize the myth you are living, to ask yourself, am I still wearing the chains of the scapegoat, or have I dared to remove them? To see the crowd of voices for what they are, to claim my vision as my own? This is not a question of intellect, but of soul. It requires courage. For to step into the role of seer is to step into responsibility. You will see what others do not. You will feel what others deny. And you will be asked to speak even when silence would be safer. But if you accept this, your wound becomes your wisdom. Your exile becomes your calling. Your burden becomes your gift. The movement from scapegoat to seer is not merely a personal story, it is an archetypal drama, lived in countless souls and mirrored in the great myths of humanity. You will find its echoes in the story of Joseph, thrown into a pit by his brothers, accused, rejected, and yet rising to become the interpreter of dreams. You will find it in the prophets, cast out by their people only to return with vision. You will find it in the alchemical texts, where lead is subjected to fire and pressure until it becomes gold. What is rejected, despised, and buried is precisely what is transformed into treasure. The wound of the empath is not erased, it is transfigured. This is why, when you look closely at those who have undergone this passage, you will notice they do not speak from theory, but from experience. Their compassion is not sentimental. It is carved into them by suffering. They do not merely sympathize. They know they have walked the dark valleys themselves, and this knowing cannot be fabricated. It is earned through fire, but to remain in the fire forever is to be consumed. The empath must learn the rhythm of descent and return. They must know when to enter the shadows and when to step back into light. They must know when to listen deeply and when to preserve silence. For if they linger too long in the role of scapegoat, they risk annihilation. If they refuse to accept the calling of seer, they risk bitterness. The art lies in holding both, the wound and the vision, the exile and the revelation. Shadow integration is the key. To be seer is to see not only the shadows of others, but one's own. The empath is tempted to live outwardly, perceiving everyone else's pain, but the true transformation occurs when they dare to gaze inward, when they recognize that the shadow they perceive in others also resides in themselves. The anger they sense in another may awaken the buried anger in their own soul. The grief they discern in another's eyes may echo the grief they have silenced. This mirroring is not a curse, but a path. By integrating their own shadow, the empath moves beyond projection. They cease to be merely a reflector of others' pain and become a conscious participant in the work of wholeness, the self. That inner totality of the psyche does not seek perfection. It seeks integration. To become whole is not to eliminate shadow, but to embrace it consciously. The empath who has embraced their own shadow no longer drowns in the emotions of others, because they have made peace with their own. They can stand in the storm without being swept away, because they know the storm within. This is the strength of the seer. They are not untouched by darkness, but they are not destroyed by it either. They have found the center, the still point within, and from that place they can witness the chaos without losing themselves. What, then, is the prophetic role of the empath in the collective psyche? It is to reveal the shadow of the community, to speak what others deny, to bring to consciousness what is hidden. The empath seer is not merely a personal healer, but a mirror for the world. They sense when society projects its darkness onto scapegoats, when the vulnerable are blamed, when outsiders are demonized, and they cry out, "This shadow is yours. This guilt is yours." These projections belong not to them, but to you. Such voices are often resisted, silenced, persecuted, yet they are indispensable. For without them, humanity repeats its unconscious rituals endlessly, sacrificing the innocent to preserve the illusion of purity. To live this prophetic role requires courage, for the seer sees too much. They cannot close their eyes once they are opened. They feel the tremors beneath culture, the undercurrents of history, the hidden violence beneath polite appearances. They know, often before others, when collapse is near, when transformation is coming. This knowing can be a heavy burden, but it is also a sacred calling. To see is to serve, not by rescuing others at the cost of oneself, but by illuminating paths, by naming shadows, by embodying wholeness. You may ask, how do I step fully into this role? The answer is both simple and difficult. You must stop rejecting your wound, you must stop running from your exile. You must turn toward the very places you fear to go, for they hold the treasure. You must claim your vision as yours, even if others do not understand it, even if they resist it, and above all, you must learn to hold the paradox, to feel deeply without drowning, to see clearly without condemning, to love fiercely without losing yourself. This is not a once and for all achievement. It is a rhythm, a lifelong dance. Again and again, you will descend into the wound. Again and again, you will rise with new vision. Each descent reveals another layer, another shadow, another gift. Each ascent strengthens your capacity to serve, to see, to illuminate. This is the spiral of individuation, the never-ending unfolding of the self. And so, let me speak plainly. You are not merely the scapegoat you once believed yourself to be. You are the vessel of vision. You are not cursed. You are initiated. Your sensitivity is not weakness. It is the organ through which the soul perceives truth. Your exile is not meaningless. It is the desert where your eyes were trained to see stars invisible to others. You have carried what was not yours. But in doing so, you discovered the depths of the human heart. And now you are called to see not only the darkness but also the light, not only the shadow but also the wholeness that lies beyond. The scapegoat becomes the seer when they stop asking, "Why was I rejected?" and begin asking, "What does my rejection reveal?" They become the seer when they stop seeking approval from those who cast them out and begin listening to the inner voice that speaks in dreams, in symbols, in whispers of the self. They become the seer when they realize that their empathy is not a burden to be carried, but a gift to be cultivated, guided, and protected. Do not think that this path isolates you forever. The exile, once transformed, often finds a new kind of community, not one based on denial and projection, but on authenticity and depth. The seer draws others who are ready to face their own shadows, who are willing to live truthfully. Such community is rare but precious. It is not built on the illusion of purity, but on the shared journey of wholeness. This, then, is the mystical completion of the journey, to live not as the scapegoat who is crushed by projections, nor as the empath who is drowned by emotions, but as the seer who perceives with clarity, who embodies compassion without erasure, who carries vision without arrogance. To live as the seer is to walk between worlds, the visible and the invisible, the personal and the archetypal, the shadow and the self. It is to live mythically, to see your life as part of a greater unfolding, to know that your suffering was not in vain, but was the very fire that forged your sight. And so I leave you with this truth. Your wound is the doorway. Your exile is your initiation. Your sensitivity is your power. What you thought was curse is in fact calling. What you thought was shame is in fact symbol. What you thought was rejection is in fact revelation. You are no longer merely the scapegoat. You are the seer,